on BBC Radio 5 Sports Extra.
Over 8,000 miles travelled from the lights of Las Vegas and Sin City. Do we arrive on the shores of the Persian Gulf for the penultimate round of the year? Just north of Doha in Qatar lies the Lusail International Circuit, a challenging, fast-paced circuit where Formula One cars can reach speeds of over 340 kilometres per hour, lit up once again as we go racing at night time. Now, whilst the Drivers' Championship may be done and dusted, with Max Verstappen making it 4 on the trot, there are still scores to be settled. The drivers' runner-up spot, the constructors' fight between McLaren and Ferrari, and the fight for the coveted 6th place in the midfield rages on. Plus, it's the last of the sprint races this season, which means we only get one practice session before we are plunged into qualifying for the sprint race later on this evening. And to guide you through all the action today is myself, Harry Benjamin, former McLaren mechanic Mark Precy, the BBC's F1 correspondent Andrew Benson. But before we hear from the two esteemed gentlemen alongside me, let's head down to our equally esteemed pit lane reporter, our eyes and ears on the ground, our own Pearl of Qatar, Rosanna Tennant.
What a big sell. Good evening. Yes, it is, of course, a night race here in Qatar. So the sun has set. There's a beautiful light. It's sort of a pinky hue, blue hue as well, as the sun starts to set and the lights have come on around the track. And it's not actually that hot. Of course, we came to the desert thinking it would be very, very warm. Do you remember last year? 40 degrees plus. That's what we experienced here a year ago. But it's just over a year ago because they've moved this race a little further back in the calendar. And so it is only 21 degrees and it is a little chilly, I have to say. There is a breeze blowing. On the way into the track, there were signs on the motorway saying strong winds, drive carefully. And we had the same sort of little bit of breeze in Las Vegas, but of course that was a street track. Here, it's a track that's wide open to the elements, a little bit of sand blowing on across the track from the desert. So there's plenty for the drivers to get their heads around. As you say, one practice session, so it's going to be critical to spend as much time out on track. And we've just seen Max Verstappen, the newly crowned 4-time world champion, get into his Red Bull, the RB20. Beautiful helmet, a white and gold one, laughing, joking with his mechanics, with his trainer Rupert, and in he gets the first practice session as a 4-time world champion. You're not surprised, Harry, I'm sure, to know that all the cameras, all the photographers were here to get a shot of him as he stepped into the car.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose, Mark, pressure's off now for Max Verstappen. Whether he really ever feels that kind of pressure, I think is always up for debate. But 2 rounds, he's wrapped it up nicely. We didn't get that title fight all the way to the end, but really I think it was that magnificent drive in Sao Paulo for Max Verstappen that really clinched it for him.
Well, that was the last part of that deal being sort of sealed, wasn't it? But I think really it's been all year, hasn't it? He's been absolutely unbelievable since the very start of this season, together with his team, of course, delivering a car that was so dominant in the early phases, and that's really what's put this championship together. You talk about pressure, he's actually been under pressure for the very first time really in a championship fight for quite a few years, and we saw what he was made of this year, and that was really tough stuff. We saw a new side to his driving, a new mature side. He had to dig deep and find different things in his game, and he did all of that. So a deserving world champion.
Well, the battle may be over then for the Drivers' Championship. Lando Norris did try and take it to him, but in the end, though, he has still got a bit of a fight with his hand for second place, with Charles Leclerc just 21 points behind him. But also, it's a crucial weekend for that fight in the constructors. McLaren versus Ferrari, which in itself is a fantastic prospect. The chances that McLaren can wrap it up this weekend are not impossible. They've got to basically win everything and get the fastest lap point to boot. But how fantastic of that is a prospect? We're not going to see Red Bull on the top. It seems like they've only got one hand in the game with Max Verstappen scoring points, so it really is going to be between the McLaren and the Ferrari.
And it's been a few years since we've been able to say that, isn't it? You know, both of those two teams, it's been a long time since they won a Constructors' Championship. McLaren back in 1998. Ferrari, when was that? 2008, I think. A long time for both of those teams. So they've had a huge amount of progression, a huge amount of turmoil in that period as well. But now they find themselves back towards the front, both on a trajectory going in the right direction. They're peaking at a point right towards the end of this season, and we've got 2 races really where that's going to be determined. You've got to say it's in McLaren's hands. Of course, they've got a lead at the moment, plus they've got a very strong car. But Ferrari have got this little bit of momentum in recent times. A very strong race in Las Vegas. They seem to be pulling pulling things together at the right moment, where McLaren are still faltering a little bit, but both teams not perfect. The very best team in terms of operations is still Red Bull right now in terms of getting everything right. Those two have been making mistakes all over across the season, and it's really going to come down to who makes the fewest of those in the final 2 rounds.
Well, the first and only practice session of the weekend is now officially underway. Green light is on at the end of the pit lane, and for those who wish to do a sync-up, it's 59 minutes and 37, 36, 35 seconds remain of FP1 as Yuki Tsunoda puts his visor down and his helmet inside the cockpit of his RB and makes his way into the fast lane and trundles down to the end of the pit lane. Max Verstappen not in too much of a rush to get out onto the circuit. Andrew Benson, the BBC's F1 correspondent, if I may bring you in for this. We've had a fair bit of news, as always, in the build-up to this week. I almost wonder where you want to start. Shall we start with the FIA news, perhaps? Because I think it's important to see this one off and kind of get clarity into what is going on, because there have been a lot of turnover when it comes to staff at the FIA this year. Can you bring us up to speed with where we're at coming into this weekend?
So 2 more people have been let go or left in the course of the last week. That's Tim Mayer, who was one of the senior stewards for the last 15 years, and Jeanette Tan, who people might not have heard of, but she was the Deputy Formula 2 race director. She was going to be the Formula 2 race director this weekend and in Abu Dhabi, but because she's left the FIA now, Rui Marquez, who only became the Formula 1 race director for Las Vegas because his predecessor Neil Vittek was sacked, has now been asked to do both jobs, which I think a lot of people in Formula 1 are a bit surprised about. Now, Tim Mayer spoke to me a couple of days ago about why he was fired. He said that the president of the FIA, Mohammed Ben Sulayem, had taken personal offence at something that was in a document that an appeal document that the Circuit of the Americas had filed over a fine that they received for a crowd invasion at this year's US Grand Prix. And Tim Mayer said that the FIA is running out of people to do these jobs, and he made some quite critical comments about Mohammed Ben Sulayem, which you can read on the BBC Sport website. And today, by the way, the Times has published another story about the FIA and things going on there, which I can't really talk about, but people can read it on the Times if they want to.
Okay, leaving us with intrigue as always. Thank you very much, Andrew Benson. I suppose...
How quickly can you Google?
Yeah, quickly. But I suppose, Mark, from a driver's perspective as well, obviously the FIA, the governing body, the race director, like the referee of Formula 1. When you have George Russell coming out with comments along the lines of it would be nice to know who's going to get fired next, and what does that do for the mentality of the athletes within the sport and their trust within how it's being run?
Well, and the sport as a whole. I mean, it's just not a good look all round. But yeah, you're right. The drivers are being quite vocal through the GPDA, the Grand Prix Drivers Association, which George Russell is chairman. So they are getting vocal on this. They're putting their point across. They want to be heard. And I think in some of the incidents that they're talking about, they have a right to be, Andrew.
Yeah, one of the things there was some very interesting revelations from Tim Mayer in the BBC Sport article. One of which was that he was fired by text message, which is obviously quite disrespectful for someone who's volunteered his time for the FIA for 15 years. He is one of their high-level race directors. He's a steward, as I said. He helps train other stewards. He's very well known within Formula 1, very well respected within Formula 1. The other thing that Tim Mayer said was that he accused Mohammed Ben Sulayem of directly intervening in topics related to the FIA, which he's not really meant to do. So the stewards, for example, are supposed to be independent. He said, Tim Mayer, that the move to punish drivers for swearing, which has been a controversy in the last couple of months, was Ben Sulayem's wish. He made that clear through his assistants to the stewards that was what he wanted. And obviously the idea that someone could be so thin-skinned as to be offended by a document to then fire someone who'd had 15 years service is quite an eye-opening bit of detail as well.
Yeah, continued questions going on surrounding the FIA and their huge turnover over the last 12 months will roll on. So you can read all of it and keep up to date with it across the BBC Sport website, as Andrew said. Right, so pretty much everybody out on track at the moment around this 5.4 kilometre track, the Lusail International Circuit. The sun hasn't quite set yet, so there's a blue pinky tinge in the air as it slowly sets and the lights continue to go on. And Rosanna Tennant, I believe, finds herself down at Mercedes.
I do. The Mercedes drivers went out just a few minutes ago, really, and lots of dust being kicked up in the pit lane, so it's extremely dusty. We've got a couple of support series here. We've got the F1 Academy Series racing F2, of course, the feeder series into F1, and we've got a Porsche series here as well. So there's going to be plenty of rubber laid down over the course of the weekend, but these cars obviously...
Coming into my helmet, so I need to change helmet after this one.
That was Max Verstappen just saying he needs to change his helmet. He's got the sun coming in, so he needs to change a little bit his visor there to deal with the sun slowly setting in the sky. Rosanna,
I think was he getting air into his helmet as well?
Did he say air as well?
Hear the radio. Yeah, we had that in Vegas, didn't we? They were getting a little bit chilly in Vegas. It's very dry here. We found that last time out as well in Vegas. Very dry air being in the desert in Nevada. Here, of course, in Qatar, same conditions apply. So, Max Verstappen, I'm sure, will be back into the pits and have a new helmet waiting for him. But yeah, very, very dusty, but hopefully the track will start to improve, to speed up. But as I said at the start of the show, just critical that you're out there to really understand what the track is doing, and they've made some changes to the track this weekend as well. Do you remember last year drivers were struggling, the tyres were being severely impacted by the curbs here? This is usually a motorcycle track. Obviously MotoGP has been here, but it's never really been a Formula 1 track until we came for the first time in 2021. So for this year they've sort of shaved some of the curbs, but I was actually talking to F1 Academy driver Abby Pulling yesterday, and she said actually some of the curbs haven't been shaved down, so still ones to watch for the drivers out there, but that's the sort of learning they're going to be doing this evening, trying to understand where to put the car given the changes.
And that was Valtteri Bottas just on the radio there saying traffic paradise, just caught up in a little bit of traffic there, I think quoting a Yuki Tsunoda line from a couple of years ago, as Tsunoda, this is the sound of him on a quick lap at the moment. Back to you, Rosanna.
Yes, Valtteri Bottas creating all sorts of headlines actually this weekend, talking about his future in the sport. Would it be at Mercedes now that Mick Schumacher, of course the son of seven-time world champion Michael Schumacher, has announced he won't be the reserve driver for Mercedes? Will Bottas go back there? Or he's even said he'd not be upset with a seat at Red Bull and working there, but he said that someone he thinks at the team has something against him there. So yeah, plenty of headlines coming out of the paddock this weekend, on top of all the FIA things you've been chatting about as well. So still some driver market chat going on. Yeah,
thanks, Rosanna. And indeed, you can listen to Rosanna's chat with Abby Pulling on our 5 Live preview show tonight, live on the radio from 9 o'clock this evening. You can hear that Abby Pulling, who can clinch the F1 Academy title this weekend. So the Alpine-backed racer looking to seal the deal this weekend. 51 minutes, 54, 53, 52 seconds remain of free practice 1. It's Yuki Tsunoda who's currently fastest with a 1:25.9 on the medium tyre, ahead of Verstappen by just over 3.5 tenths. Then it's Russell, Albon, Norris, the top 5. Verstappen has actually just gone quicker and put himself to the top of the times. Ocon is 6th, ahead of Sainz, Piastri, Leclerc the top 10. Then it's Perez, Hamilton, Magnussen, Bottas, Stroll 15th, Gasly, Alonso, Joe, Hulkenberg and Franco Colapinto 20th and last. Everyone either on the medium or the hard tyre. Pirelli bringing their hardest tyres in the range because of the nature of this track. And Mark, Rosanna was mentioning about the tyre issues we saw last year. It was so bad that Pirelli had to bring in a mandated minimum pit stop throughout the race, making it a 3-stop race. But they have changed things this weekend. Here's Russell.
Pretty rubbish, not much bite.
George Russell then needing some more improvement to how his car is braking. But it's the pyramid-shaped curves that they have here. They basically had the tips rounded off at 7 of the corners to make the impact a little less on the tyre, and also to manage the track limits issues. Some gravel strips have been implemented behind some of the curves as well, which is a thing we're actually seeing more and more at these types of circuits, which are becoming, well, the majority of the calendar these days.
Yeah, and the sort of thin strip of gravel just beyond the curb is actually something, I think we saw it first in Austria perhaps, didn't we? And it was this idea of sort of self-policing track limits, where if you go over the curb and you step further than about 1.5 meters, I think it is, outside of the white line, which would in turn mean that both of your wheels are off the white line, it prevents you going out there, because the penalty to go out there is so self-policing in that you lose time by being stuck in a gravel trap. So it seems like a decent and sensible solution. It's been implemented here as well, so we'll see how that plays out. But yeah, you're right. I think there's a lot of changes from last year to this year, both with the circuit and those things with the curbs and the gravel traps we talked about, but also with the as Rosanna said, the race being pushed back in the year means that the temperatures are very, very different. This is going to be a completely different race weekend from an engineering perspective to the one that it was last year, with 40-degree temperatures. Drivers were struggling, cars were struggling. It impacted the tyres in so many different ways, and it impacted, as a result of that, the performance of individual cars differently. If you think back to just a week ago in Las Vegas, Mercedes had this unbelievably dominant weekend, largely due to cooler temperatures. Well, that will have swung slightly back towards their favour, given that it's much, much cooler than people predicted here just a week later on the other side of the planet.
Yeah, I think it was Logan Sargent last year had to pull out from the race early because he was so unwell. So that was how tricky and hard it was for the drivers. The heat of Qatar is much cooler this time around. Just listening to the sound of Carlos Sainz negotiating his way through some traffic in the Ferrari. Meanwhile, Rosanna is down at Red Bull.
And both drivers have just been in. Max Verstappen was first into the pit box. Couple of clicks changed on the front wing, and then he was on his way again. So no change of helmet. We heard him, didn't we, on the radio saying too much air is being let in, but they didn't opt to change a helmet then. Obviously, that might be considered a waste of time in this critical 1 hour of practice, the only hour of practice. And then Sergio Perez came in behind Verstappen. A couple of clicks for him as well on the front wing. So just altering the setup, getting the drivers comfortable with how the car is for this session, and obviously how it will then behave in the sprint qualifying session later on. So both now back out on track.
Just Rosanna, talking about the air coming into Max Verstappen's helmet, it may well be that there's a problem with the helmet, which they'll obviously fix fairly easily, or it could just be that they can change that little windscreen or the air deflector that sits just ahead of the driver. It changes the way that the air flows over and around the driver's helmet, and they try to optimise that, of course, from an aerodynamic benefit perspective. But if it is negatively impacting the driver, there'll be different versions of that, different configurations that might have different cutouts in it, might be slightly different shapes or sizes, that may potentially compromise the aerodynamics by a tiny amount, but might just suit the driver a bit more. So perhaps in between the sessions, before we get into sprint qualifying, that might be something they'll look at.
I love how they have all the different helmets and visors ready for the drivers. When we go, obviously, full night race in Singapore, when it's raining, you see those wonderful little emojis, don't you, on the front of the helmet visor, with little clouds and little raindrops. Love that.
Certainly are getting to grips with these conditions. This is the sound of Charles Leclerc making his way through the right-handers at 12, 13, then 14. They all feed into each other before you get a little reprieve, a little bit of traffic as well in the form of the Sauber of Joe Guan Yu before Charles Leclerc reaches turn 15 and now makes his way down towards the right-hander of turn 16, the final corner, the pit lane entry to your right. Don't want out too wide there. Keeps it within the white lines, does Charles Leclerc, and across the line on that hard tyre. Lost a bit of time thanks to that traffic in the final sector. Slots into 7th behind his teammate. Gasly is now the fastest car out there, 1:24.8, less than a tenth separating him and George Russell. Now, Mark, Mercedes still can't explain why they were so good in Las Vegas. The more you dig into it, the more it does feel like it's clearly a temperature-related factor, and they perform well in a really narrow working window. But there is some optimism for them around this weekend as well.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, the temperatures are a lot cooler than many people would have predicted, certainly compared to last year, so that will be in their favour. It's also a very smooth racetrack, and that means that Mercedes can run the car very, very low to the ground, which is really where their sweet spot is. You get onto any kind of bumpy surface, most other racetracks around the world, or many of them that we go to, they have to raise the rear ride height particularly, just to cope with those bumps, to stop the bottoming and that bouncing that they suffer with. And as soon as they raise the rear ride height, it moves that car just outside of that performance window, and they suffer massively. So this weekend, with the really smooth nature of this track, that could well suit them.
It's actually not that different from the pattern that they had for the previous 2 years. They were quick, as Mark says, when they could run the car low. The car was designed, well, actually the first year's car, 22, was designed to run low. Then actually what went wrong last year was that they designed the car to run higher and realised that they should have designed it to run low, like everybody else was. And now this year they've got it running low again as its optimum design window. And some cars are more flexible in terms of their ride height operability. They retain more of their downforce as you raise the car up. For the Ferrari, for example, that's why the Ferrari is so quick on street circuits, because it keeps more of its downforce when you raise the ride height a bit. But it's good news for Mercedes theoretically this weekend, because it's, as Rosanna was saying, it's not as hot in Qatar as it was last year, because it's a different time of year. It's not that much later in the year, by the way. It's only a month or so, but still, it's amazing how much the temperatures have gone down. But it's a lot hotter than it was in Las Vegas last weekend, though, Harry. And it's a very smooth track, so they should be able to run the car low again. But there's a lot of theoretical stuff that people talk about with Mercedes this year, which then doesn't always transpire in reality. So let's wait and see whether they are actually competitive this weekend. Really, the two cars that this track should suit most are the Red Bull and the McLaren. Here's Lawson's radio.
Curious, honestly.
Okay, focus on yourself. Copy that.
Not exactly best mates, are they? Liam Lawson and Sergio Perez, since he came back to Formula One in the second RB. So the Red Bull is the best car in high-speed corners, and the McLaren is the best car in medium-speed corners, and Qatar is basically all medium-speed corners and high-speed corners. Here's Alonso.
I nearly crashed in 4 on 5. So everyone is slowed down. He also gets signs.
Yeah.
Now, he's obviously angry about traffic, Harry. It looked like that was a Red Bull as well, right?
Yeah, it did. Yeah. He sort of was pincered by two cars there, but they were both trying to get out of the way, but Alonso was threading the needle and backed out of it as he was trying to turn into the right-hander. Clearly traffic management is an issue. And we're just seeing Charles Leclerc going for another quick lap. The fact that we've got some sort of high, medium speed corners, long duration corners, Andrew, as well, is that why Ferrari is sort of coming into this weekend feeling like they're going to be on the back foot?
Well, actually, Carlos Sainz said, I can't remember which race he was saying it at, whether it was Las Vegas or the one before, whichever that was. What was the one before Las Vegas? Brazil. That'd be the one. That he was actually quite scared about Qatar. Yes, because the Ferrari's strength is low-speed corners, which is why it's so good on street circuits, because street circuits generally have low-speed corners and short-duration corners as well. It's less good in a transient condition and long corners, so they are worried. But McLaren and Red Bull are not quite so convinced about that as they might have been in the past. They think that this new flaw that Ferrari introduced in Monza has actually fixed some of their problems, so they actually think Ferrari will be more competitive than Ferrari are pretending that they expect to be. Let's see.
Good old-fashioned sandbagging. That's what we like to hear. Right to the bitter end of this, the longest ever season of Formula One, with the Constructors' title. Well, it could go all the way to the wire.
I have to say, so far, it looks like Ferrari do look pretty quick. Charles Leclerc's just gone fastest again, and he's on the hard tyre, whereas everyone else around him's on the medium. So it's certainly Leclerc is looking very hooked up in these early minutes of this first practice session.
We're only 20 minutes in, Andrew.
True, I know. I don't want to get carried away.
Can't get too excited. Carlos Sainz is just approaching the end of his lap. Let's just see where he puts the second Ferrari round the final corner to the line for the Spaniard, and he goes fourth fastest, also on the hard tyre. Charles Leclerc, though, fastest, a 1:23.7, ahead of Max Verstappen, who's currently in the pits, Rosanna.
He is. He came in a few minutes ago and immediately immediately his helmet was starting to be unclipped. Of course, it's all attached to the hands device, the sort of safety device that the drivers wear. So his helmet's come off. They're now getting him a new one. Still the lovely white and gold one with the new 4 stars on the back. So switching helmets to get rid of that problem he was encountering with too much air coming in. And that was a bit confusing. The Red Bull mechanics just came out ready for a pit stop. Assume it would have been for Perez, given Verstappen is in the garage. But they've all just gone back in, so a bit of confusion there. Better during practice than during the sprint or the race itself. Meanwhile, McLaren just did a practice pit stop for Oscar Piastri, and Ferrari also doing one down at the back there. And I can't see who just came in and out then. I'm too far up the pit lane. But yeah, quite a busy pit lane, I have to say. People practicing, getting themselves in order ahead of what is a very busy weekend, a sprint weekend.
Now, I've got some interesting information about Alpine. Pierre Gasly is currently third fastest behind Charles Leclerc and Max Verstappen, and that sort of underlines their improved form in the last few races, which with the noise you're hearing is Sergio Perez going off track, by the way. Not doing the floor of his car any good, going over those curbs, I wouldn't imagine. Anyway, you may remember that Pierre Gasly had a really strong weekend in qualifying in Las Vegas. He was qualified right up at the front, and then he retired from the race with a blown engine. Now, what happened, you might have wondered, about Pierre Gasly's engine? Well, it turns out that he got a tow from Yuki Tsunoda, and the car reached 361 kilometers an hour under DRS. The engine went up to 12,937 revs. Here's radio. Hamilton complaining about lack of stability. Sorry, I didn't hear the bleeps, everybody. That was my fault. And I wasn't looking at the TV screen. The engine reached 12,937 revs in 8th gear and then exploded. Wow.
Well, there you go. The power of DRS.
What basically happened was it hit the limiter in 8th gear and it bent an exhaust valve. So with the tailwind and the DRS and the tow, it hit a speed that they wouldn't normally get up to.
RB sabotaging their rivals right there in that battle for 6th place in the constructors, which is really heating up. I know we talk about the title fight between McLaren and Ferrari, but there are really only 4 points separating Haas, Alpine and RB, 6th, 7th and 8th in that coveted 6th place position, and that is big money for those teams, isn't it, Mark?
It is. And whilst Andrew's really done a very good job of explaining what happened there, it's not something that should happen, clearly, because those are conditions that can be experienced, and so they will have to look at that as an abject failure, and we'll have to dig into why it's happened. I mean, you could say, well, maybe they should just bin those off and go and buy a Mercedes or something.
Well, maybe.
What a crazy idea that would be.
I think there's some legs to that, I think you might be right. Alpine, who will switch to Mercedes power. They've actually brought a couple of upgrades this weekend. They brought a front wing and a slightly shorter nose. The only team to bring any kind of performance upgrade this weekend. Sauber brought a front wing as well, but it's circuit specific more than not. That was the sound you just heard of Franco Colapinto looking like that. Williams is a bit of a handful to turn into the right-hander of turn 5, just running out slightly wide and scratching the underside of that Williams along the curbs. He does get it turned in though. Colapinto now might well have had his confidence slightly affected after the huge crash in Q2 last weekend in Vegas, which saw Williams having their 15th crash of the season, when spare parts and dealing with the issues under a cost cap era is tough enough. Williams very much hoping to get to the end of 2024 as cleanly as possible.
It was a bad crash too. He hit the inside wall, especially when he knows that spare parts are really at a premium at Williams at the moment. He shouldn't have. Really not excusable from Franco Colapinto, that in a practice session. Just to go back to that Hamilton radio message, which we kind of glossed over a bit, where I was giving you all those stats about exploding Alpine engines.
Quite right.
Yeah, he was talking about a lack of stability. That's bad news for Lewis Hamilton. It's been his big problem all year, the unpredictability of the rear end of that Mercedes. It's why he hasn't been able to, it's one of the reasons he believes he hasn't been able to compete with George Russell in qualifying. The qualifying stats are very heavily skewed in George Russell's favour. And of course, Hamilton had a really strong weekend in Las Vegas, apart from the fact that he messed up Q3. Had he not messed up Q3, he probably would have qualified on the front row and might well have won. But he didn't. He qualified 10th as a result. But often what happens with Hamilton this year is, if his weekend starts badly, it kind of stays bad. If it starts good, it kind of stays good generally. Or sometimes it goes bad as well, but it doesn't generally start bad and then get good. So that's not it doesn't augur that well for Lewis Hamilton this weekend, even at these early days. And as Mark said a few minutes ago, it is only first practice, but
it's the only practice.
And there might be almost flashbacks for last year when Lewis Hamilton collided with George Russell last year into turn 1. It seems so long ago that happened, but an uncharacteristic mistake from Lewis Hamilton this time last year. But right now, though, on the track in this free practice one, it is all quiet out there. Just the one car out on track, which is the RB of Liam Lawson, as the sun is slowly starting to set. The floodlights are coming on and getting closer to full beam, illuminating this just over 5.4 kilometre circuit, 16 turns, 6 to the left and 10 to the right, and with 36 minutes and 11, 10, 9 seconds remaining, Charles Leclerc with the fastest lap time on the hard tyre as well, a 1:23.7. He's a tenth ahead of Verstappen, who has just come out of the pit lane now. Then it's Gasly, Norris, Sainz, the top 5, Russell, Tsunoda, Albon, Hamilton, Perez is 10th, ahead of Piastri, Alonso, Lawson, Ocon, Bottas the top 15, Stroll, Magnussen, Hulkenberg, Zhou and Colapinto, the 20 drivers. And, well, in a couple of years, Mark, I'll be going down to 22, because there has been an agreement made between General Motors and Formula One for a deal to have the Cadillac brand to enter the sport in 2026, which is absolutely brilliant news, I think, for the sport, but not quite the form we thought it would take as well.
It's been a real sort of soap opera, hasn't it? The whole story. People at home will remember it being, bandied around under the umbrella of being an Andretti entry. You may remember that some time ago, and it really was quite a long time ago, that was entry was pitched to the FIA and to Formula One. The FIA sort of gave it its approval. It then got passed on to Formula One, who rejected that. And so, at one point we thought the story was dead, and then of course Andretti continued in the background to effectively act and operate like a Formula One team would operate. They started employing staff. They hired a sort of facility. They filled it with equipment. They started designing a car, all of the while not having a Formula One entry. And I mean, Andrew will be able to fill in the gaps here, but effectively what's happened is there have been some major changes to that proposal, one of which is Michael Andretti stepping away from it, and that seems to be a major factor. The other, that there's a much greater involvement from GM, so a major global manufacturer getting involved has really helped to convince Formula One that this is not just an entry by Andretti with a name attached to it from a manufacturer. This is a manufacturer really full supported entry, and I think that's one of the biggest factors that seems to have changed their mind.
Yeah, it's a very unusual situation, isn't it? You've basically summed it up pretty well, Mark. What's interesting is it's basically the same operation. It's not called Andretti anymore, but it's the same bunch of people. Michael Andretti is not involved. He's moved out of the frame. He's not involved in the ownership or management of his own, the team that's named after him anymore. A guy called Dan Tauris now runs that. But the same people who are employed at this sort of place in Silverstone that they've set up are going to be are making the team. And Cadillac, the sort of luxury brand of General Motors, they're still involved. The big difference that's convinced Formula One in one way is that it's branded as a Cadillac team, and there's a bit more commitment from Cadillac, so the partners in it financially are Cadillac, GM, and this guy Dan Tauris and his business partner. That's one thing. And I think the other thing that's worth bearing in mind is that the US Department of Justice has been doing an investigation into Formula One's decision to reject the initial Andretti bid. And I think the fact that investigation is going on has kind of greased the wheels a little bit to get this thing up and running in Formula One. And of course, what I don't know, but people are looking at and wondering, is that there's also been some changes in the very top management of Formula One. Greg Maffei, who the CEO of Liberty Media, is stepping down at the end of the year. I'm told that's not related to this, but of course Maffei is the guy who's in charge, and was the guy who was in charge when the DOJ investigation was launched. So some people in Formula One are putting two and two together. Whether they're actually adding them up and making 756, I don't know, but but that's essentially what's happened. All that stuff's sort of come together. It's the same thing but different. You could describe it as.
But ultimately, it does mean when you get two more drivers on the grid, a whole new team of people, massive amount of employment. And, you know, ultimately for us, that should translate into more good Formula One racing. We hope 2026 is a whole new era of this sport. So there's so many changes across the board. There's so many unknowns. But to add an extra team and everything that comes along with that, I think can only add to it.
Lando Norris just ran wide at turn 5, by the way. That was the crunch you heard as he went over the gravel. It provides a bigger American presence as well. 3 races on the calendar now with a GM and Cadillac brand, which is mainly made for the American market. And there is also rumour around Colton Herta, once again the IndyCar driver who races for that team in that championship, being possibly one of the drivers. That surely should be another driving contender as to why Formula One has agreed to have them.
Well, I'll tell you what's interesting about this is that Formula One has now got 6 major car manufacturers in the sport from 2026. So you've got building engines, you've got Mercedes. See if I can remember them all off the top of my head.
Here we go.
You've got Mercedes, you've got Ferrari, you've got Honda, you've got GM, you've got Ford, and you've got Audi. And Audi, Ford, GM and Honda have all decided to come in because of the new 2026 engine regulations. Now, in Formula One, there's a bit of grumbling, a bit of discontent behind the scenes, quite quietly. I was talking to one of the team bosses in Las Vegas. He was moaning about how these new engine regulations have cost the people who are currently in Formula One collectively $4 billion. And it's all because of Audi coming in. But I think he was painting a rather vulgar picture, because had it not been the case, Honda wouldn't have stayed, Ford wouldn't have come, Audi wouldn't have come, GM wouldn't have come. It's all because of this much greater proportion of power produced by the hybrid part of the engine from 2026. It's going to be up to around about 50%. It's caused all sorts of issues with the cars. They've had to create very complex cars to recover enough energy to make that work. And also it's breaking up what has become an incredibly competitive field, of course. So people are looking at that and going, did we really need to do this? But the ship's sailed, I'm afraid. It's happened. It is happening. On the face of it, having 6 car manufacturers in because of those engine regulations is a huge... it's like the phrase has slipped my mind, but it's an endorsement of the direction that Formula One has taken with those new rules.
It really puts the sport in a very strong place, you know, commercially, from a technical point of view, from an engineering perspective. The message that Formula One really wants to portray with 26 and beyond is this one of real technology to support sustainability. We've got sustainable fuels, we've got this increased, as Andrew said, increased proportion of the power unit being from the hybrid part of that tech as well. And all of these manufacturers, of course, want to get on board with that, because from their road car side of things, they want to sell more hybrid road cars. They want to tick that sustainability box as well, as the sport does. So all of those things are very much aligned. The problem we are likely to have in 26, as Andrew just touched on there, is that right now in 24, great racing, amazing championship. 2025 looking like it could be the same, if not even better, with some of these great teams. McLaren maybe starting the season in the strong form they're finishing this one. Ferrari doing the same. Red Bull, maybe even Mercedes too. We could have a great championship, and then in 26 everything changes and it's a real lottery as to what happens. And fans are going to look at that and go, well, why on earth are we changing something that's working so well? Of course, these decisions had to be made, 5 years ago and beyond, and it's the same every time we have a major regulation change. It's the final year of the stable set of regs, which is almost always the best.
Piastri just had a moment through the left-hand kink of turn 15. We saw Perez run out wide there as well, turned it in, lost the rear, caught it, and there was a nice bit of gravel strip waiting for you to collect a bit of dust that goes back onto the circuit. Just to come back to the power unit situation though, Andrew, when General Motors and Cadillac come in, they won't have their own power supply, as Lando Norris is rally styling it through the left-hander in the first sector, trying to hold on to it, just about does. So the McLaren's pushing hard and lacking a little bit of grip at times. But GM and Cadillac won't be powered under their own steam when they come in, will they?
No, their engine's coming down the line, probably 28, 29, something like that. That's what they're aiming for. Initially, they'll have probably a Ferrari engine. If you remember, Sauber are currently supplied by Ferrari. Sauber's turning into Audi in 2026, so that's a free Ferrari. That's a Ferrari engine supply that's been freed up, if you like. The rules basically do state that the manufacturer, there's a way of forcing the engine manufacturers to supply a team that doesn't have an engine with an engine to make sure that no team ever goes without. And obviously the team that would have fewest customers would be Honda in 2026, because they are only supplying Aston Martin. But they have despite that rule, they have an exclusive supply deal with Aston Martin. I don't quite know how that was allowed to happen, but anyway, it has done. So it's not guaranteed it'll be Ferrari, by the way, but it's the obvious solution, and talks are going on at the moment.
Okay, we'll talk of Ferrari 1 and 2 as Carlos Sainz comes across the line to go second fastest, both on the hard tyre, a 10th separating Leclerc and Sainz. Norris, Verstappen, Gasly, the top 5. Russell, Tsunoda, Albon, Alonso, Hulkenberg is 10th, ahead of Hamilton. Then comes Perez in 12th, Bottas, Piastri and Lawson making up the top 15. Then it's Ocon, Magnussen, Stroll, Zhou and Colapinto, the 20 cars who have all made it out on track. Indeed, pretty much everybody is out there at the moment, with the exception of the Alpine of Esteban Ocon. His teammate, meanwhile, Pierre Gasly, has just come across the line to start another flying lap on the medium tyre.
It really is all going to be about tyres, as it often is, almost always is in fact, in the practice sessions. But given it's a sprint weekend, and this being the real key session before we get into sprint qualifying later, it's going to be about how you understand how these tyres work on this very smooth racetrack with these new curbs and how much you can use them. For example, given the troubles we had last year in those extreme temperatures, this is a massively steep learning curve here, and you've got 1 hour to figure out how to set your car up to get the best out of them and get them into that critical window. Here's Leclerc.
What the hell? How is this doing?
Clearly traffic is going to be an issue, particularly in the first part of qualifying. We're going to have the same kind of thing with all 20 cars on track. They're finding that they're tripping over each other. They all want to be on the same bit of circuit, bit of racetrack, so that's going to be one to watch later. But this session, they're now trying to figure out how their car works in these temperatures and whether they need to make any mechanical changes or changes to the driving style to just change the window that it's currently operating is. Gasly goes wide as well. The wind, by the way, is a major factor here, and I think that's what a lot of drivers have been caught out with. That's another factor that needs to be taken into consideration and learnt and understood, given the fact that it's going to keep changing, as is the circuit, the high evolution around this racetrack too. They've got to figure out what tweaks they can make with a very small window of time they've got to get the very best, and that window of operation, particularly around tyres, is a very small one.
This is the sound of Pierre Gasly in the pink and black Alpine, making his way through the double right-handers at 12 and then just absolutely sails on wide at 13, makes it back onto the track for the final of the triple right-handers of 14, just carrying a lot of speed and understeering off the track. Here's his radio.
It's at the front of the car.
Gasly just saying, can you check the front of the car, as he clouted over the curb. A little bit of gravel as well waiting for you on the exit. He's made it back onto the circuit though, and might well be coming down the pits shortly.
I don't know about you, Harry, but this was the third Grand Prix in Qatar. I still haven't got my head around which corner the cars are at on the telly when we're watching. It's really hard to tell.
It is tricky. I often find the driver tracker is quite handy in this situation.
I've just turned it on, actually.
Well, I'm just looking at the driver tracker, and it's unbelievably busy. There isn't really much of a section of racetrack that doesn't have a car in it right now, which is reflecting this conversation we're hearing amongst drivers. So I think the wind, just talking about the wind is quite strong. It's blowing in a sort of southerly direction right now, 4.3 metres per second as we speak. But I watched a little bit of the F2 practice session earlier on today, and a couple of drivers there in some of these high-speed corners getting caught out as they go through and turn the direction of their car into a different, the direction of the wind. They get massively caught out, lose downforce at the rear of the car, and massive snap of oversteer. And there is a lot of runoff here, but they end up running very, very wide, some of them deep into a gravel trap. So they're going to have to keep an eye on that wind, because as Rosanna said at the top of the show, we're in a very flat, open space here in the desert, so it's always going to be a problem for them.
Sainz has just gone fastest, by the way, in all three sectors, put themselves at the top on 1:23.0, 3/10 clear of his teammate Charles Leclerc. So the Ferrari's flying in this one and only practice session. Just to come back to what Andrew said, though, it's quite a good point. Do you think, with the more new tracks we get, we're getting a lot in the Middle East, the Americas, these big tracks, fast sweeping, you kind of lose a little bit of tracks that have stood out as icons in a way. We just had Monza that has extended through to 2031, and you can look at that, you can look at a car anywhere on the Monza track and catch a fleeting glimpse of it and know exactly where it is. But on the tracks like Qatar, you lose that.
Bahrain's another one.
Bahrain, we're losing that.
Well, it's it's true. And it's always going to be the case, isn't it? I mean, we sound like grumpy old people here talking about it wasn't as good as it was in the olden days, was it? But here's Perez.
Then McLaren is flying.
Perez saying that McLaren is flying. One car that isn't flying is Esteban Ocon. Been confined to the pits for a little while now. Rosanna Tennant, what more can you tell us?
I've just been watching Esteban Ocon's mechanics work pretty hard on his car. The team tell me they're just making routine setup changes, but the little box between the sort of front suspension bit has been opened up, and I think that's normally where the transponder is, and a few little wires are being cut and moved. That box has now been closed up. I think they're tinkering with the suspension rods at the moment, but lots of mechanics on hand. 5 working on it currently, and Esteban Ocon just sitting patiently in his cockpit. So he hasn't got out of the car. Supposedly routine setup changes, but I'll keep you posted. Still here. Very breezy in the pit lane, Harry.
Thanks, Rosanna. Yeah, Esteban Ocon then, who was not a happy boy after Las Vegas, finished down in 17th. Felt he could have been fighting up there for points alongside Nico Hülkenberg in the rival Haas as they fight for that 6th place in the constructors, and miscommunication between Ocon and Alpine for his pit stop in Vegas. Drove into the pits and was told to keep on going, and effectively gave himself a drive-through penalty because the team weren't ready for him. Another man who had the same thing was Lance Stroll, but he suffered with having absolutely no radio all race long. So it was a bit of a hazard a guess and come in for your pit stop on the Aston Martin side of things. But Ocon in the Alpine keen to try and finish off his last couple of rounds with the French team as best as he can. Indeed, in the Drivers' Championship, battling over pride, just a few points between himself and his teammate Pierre Gasly. They're 12th and 14th respectively in the Drivers' Championship at the moment. Gasly staying on, and he'll be teamed up with Jack Doohan next season as one of the many rookies we'll see next year, which I think we're all looking forward to.
Very much so, yeah. I just want to quickly go back to the chat about circuit types we were talking about, because one of the things I was going to say is you're going to forevermore you're going to struggle to build a 100-year-old circuit in a forest, which is what we all want.
Yeah.
So that's not going to happen anymore. But the other side of all this is that with a long season now, 24 races, a lot of street tracks, a lot of circuits popping up in new locations and new territories, what you're getting is a much wider variety of racetrack across the season. And so when you're designing a Formula One car, in the old days of 16 races, predominantly in Europe, very sort of stereotypical type of racetrack, you could design a car that worked very well in most places. Now that's a much harder thing to do. So now you might have a car that works at some tracks, but another team might have a car that works at others. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot of in 2024 and beyond. And I kind of think it's good for the sport. You know, it gives us this ebb and flow of performance, which as fans we love.
Yes, exactly why is the performances change between the teams over the course of the season. You know, Ferrari going well on a certain kind of circuit, as I was saying earlier, McLaren on another, like the Hungary type of circuit, and then Red Bull on another, at least once the initial domination period was done. Norris just made a very late entry into the pits. One of the reasons for it is that these ground effect cars, it's very, very difficult to get them to be optimized in every type of corner all at once. You can tend to get them working in slow speed or high speed, but not both. So teams have to kind of pick what they want the car to do most optimally, and then kind of just deal with the compromises elsewhere. And I mean, you see it, and also the budget cap plays into that as well. So one of the things that's come up in the last couple of races is the rear wing on the Red Bull. Verstappen was complaining in Las Vegas that, or at least people may remember in Las Vegas, that they had a rear wing that they carved 2 scoops out of the flap off after the first day's practice, because it had too much drag, too much downforce basically. And that's because that's the lowest downforce rear wing that Red Bull have, whereas McLaren and Ferrari and Mercedes have a wing that has less drag on it, that they can go to for those sorts of circuits. But that's not because Red Bull can't design a low drag wing. It's because they've chosen not to design a low drag wing, and they just basically decided we're going to take the hit on the tracks that need that wing, and there's only 2 effectively, Monza and Las Vegas. But Verstappen was saying after practice, well, look, maybe we need to think about this, because it's basically writing off 2 races. Can we afford to do that? I think the designers would turn around and go, well, it's not like we didn't know that.
Yeah.
It's just a decision we had to make.
It's a good point. In America, they design different cars for street circuits, oval racing, but it's a very different format, and it's a very different playground that they're operating in. So the modern day Formula One, I think the budget cap, I personally think the budget cap's been a real success in this sport in terms of levelling out the playing field, making teams think more efficiently about where and how to spend their money. There are complications around it, but I think it's been generally a good thing. But it does have impacts like this.
Well, just to go back to the point about the engine regulations, that's also why all these manufacturers are coming in, because there's a budget cap for 2026 onwards for engines now as well as chassis. So they're only allowed to spend $95 million a year. That's the current level. Whereas before, when manufacturers came in, they were basically committing themselves to a bottomless pit of money, and many of them didn't want to do that. But now they're looking at a situation where we know we're spending $95 million on the engine each year, we're spending $135 million on the team each year, and we're able to make a profit, and the asset that we're using is worth $1 billion. So in terms of financially, suddenly being involved in Formula One makes sense. You can look at it as a business that makes money, whereas before it was just a business that costs money.
Is it a huge advantage though at the moment for teams like Audi, like GM, who are not yet in Formula One but can continue to build their team? They're not restricted by that budget cap.
They are.
They are.
Yeah.
So they don't get any kind of advantage then.
Well, as people may remember a story I wrote, I think it was in Austin. Audi actually have been given a bigger budget cap than the other teams, but that's not because they're a new team, it's because of where they're located. They've decided, the FIA, obviously this is not always necessarily popular, and there's a lot of issues going on at the FIA at the moment, but this decision was based on internationally recognised figures for average salaries in particular countries, and it was decided that if the average salary was higher in one country than another, that team should be allowed to have a higher spending capacity, which makes sense, because one of the things that people were questioning about the Audi project is why they bought Sauber, because in Switzerland salaries are higher, therefore you are inevitably already at a disadvantage, because you have to spend, because salaries obviously take up quite a large amount of the costs of a Formula One team. If you're having to spend more on your salaries because of where your team's located, you've got less to spend on your car. How are you ever going to be competitive in that situation? But the FIA has tried to equalise that out.
Okay, that's the voice of the BBC's F1 correspondent Andrew Benson, alongside myself, Harry Benjamin, the former McLaren mechanic Mark Priestley, and down in the pits, it's Rosanna Tennant.
You give me the big
every time.
There's not much going on down here. I know it's been a very quiet session in the pit lane, as I said at the very start, that everyone is going to be wanting to maximise their time out on track. They don't want to be in the pit lane, but actually a couple of drivers are. The Williams drivers are both in. Franco Colapinto actually is just being given the signal that he's going to head out, and Alex Albon came in about 5 or 10 minutes ago. The mechanic quickly grabbed a bollard, just a normal, orange and white little cone, popped it down in the pit box. Alex Albon came into the pit, stopped at the bollard, he moved it, and then Alex Albon went into full practice start mode, I would say, and out he went from the grid, or the pit box, laying down so much rubber and drifting slightly, and he got seriously close to one of the mechanics waiting to do a pit stop at RB. It was a little bit reminiscent of my days as a pit reporter for the F2 series, where they really wiggle around in the pit lane. So a little bit of action here in the pit lane.
It's all, of course, I'm sure you know this, but it's all very deliberate, of course, because that little bollard is just a little sighter, so the driver can get used to stopping without having to go up against a human being, which poses some threats and some dangers. There's a bollard that can do the same job. And then laying the rubber down, of course, is being done so that for the rest of the weekend, that rubber can act as a grippier surface than the sort of concrete surface that's there now. So when they do come to race day and they're trying to pull out of the pits in the fastest way possible to save ultimate race time, that rubber is there to try and aid them to do that. So even now, in the very first practice session, they're thinking about the race, both the sprint race but also the main race, feature race on Sunday.
Absolutely, and you can see the tyre tracks just weaving their way back out into the fast lane of the pit lane. So, as you say, they're thinking about all these little bits that are going to add up to hopefully a successful weekend. And after he'd done that little practice start to lay down the rubber, Alex Albon did one lap and then came straight back in. So that was obviously all part of their programme. So many things to consider when you've only got 1 hour of practice as well. You've got to cram it all in.
You certainly do, and Williams, talk of them, are really in need of a stronger weekend, as we mentioned, off the back of 15 crashes now over the course of a season. Colapinto's car was rebuilt in Vegas after that Q2 crash, but he no longer has the same spec car as Alex Albon as a result, due to lack of spare parts, that budget cap, and getting towards the end of the season, and full focus being really on next season's car. Colapinto also having to learn this track. He's never raced here before. He's one of the only few cars out on track, along with Gasly and Sainz, who's on an out lap now. Colapinto just begins his lap, the Argentine racer. Has the shine slightly worn off Franco Colapinto now? There is still a bubbling rumour of Colapinto maybe ending up somewhere in the Red Bull family next year, but seems to have gone a little bit quiet.
Well, you could argue the shine's been taken off, but only because the shine was so bright after his first couple of rounds. His first appearance in Formula One and the first few races he did was so impressive. But if you actually think about the bigger picture, he's a rookie that's just in his very first experience of Formula One, and if you take that picture as a whole, he's done incredibly well in any rookie season with very little in terms of practice. He's had no testing, don't forget, before his appointment, really. Nothing of any substance. You're going to expect a few crashes. You need your driver to be pushing to the limit, and in any normal season you'd expect that, you'd accept it, you'd even ask that driver to be pushing to the limit, and you'd take a few crashes. But the reason he was brought in was to stop the crashes that were happening from the driver that was before him in Logan Sargent. So that's why there's been a tiny bit of shine taken off. And as you said, from Williams' point of view, it's actually got quite serious from a budget perspective, let alone the amount of work that's had to go into repairing these cars over a season. In a budget capped era, you rightly point out, that can have a major impact.
Well, he might have some confidence coming to Qatar. Of course, a couple of years ago it was only a few miles down the road in the Lusail Stadium, where Argentina beat France on penalties to seal the World Cup. Did you like that?
I was there, mate.
Were you there?
I was there.
You get everywhere, don't you, Priestley?
Just showing off now, Priestley.
Honestly.
That was a great match.
It was. Yeah.
It certainly was, and perhaps Colapinto, well, maybe can take a little bit of hope coming to the shores of the Persian Gulf, although he just did have a little moment running out wide as he continues to learn this track. Colapinto down in 19th at the moment. He's put on the soft tyre with 10 minutes left to go. It's the two Ferraris still fastest out in front on that harder tyre, though. Just under 4/10 separating Sainz and Leclerc. Then it's Norris, Gasly, Verstappen is 5th, Piastri, Alonso, Russell, Tsunoda. Albon is 10th and is out there as well on that soft tyre. First lap, we'll see what he's got. Doing a little qualifying simulation run towards the end ahead of Hülkenberg, Ocon, Hamilton, Perez. Stroll is 15th, Bottas is 16th. Then comes Lawson, Magnussen, Colapinto and Zhou Guanyu 20th and last for Sauber. And pretty much the entire grid is locked in for next year, but there is still that big question mark over Sergio Perez's future. He's currently down in 14th, 1.9 seconds off the pace, off the back of another miserable weekend, let's face it, in Vegas, and that second RB seat as a result is still yet to be confirmed.
It's funny, isn't it? We've got 20 drivers contracted for seats next year, and yet there's still a lot of talk about the driver market. It's crazy, but you know, look, the Red Bull thing and Sergio Perez we've talked about to death over the course of the second half of this season especially, but they have to make a change. They have lost out almost certainly on the Constructors' Championship, you know, as a direct result of Sergio Perez not being able to score anywhere near the points of his teammate, and they can't allow that to happen next year. So they have to make a change. They've got to make it before this season starts and have a better run at it next time around.
The stats don't read well continually for Checo. 6 Q1 eliminations. That's the same for Max Verstappen's entire career. This season Perez has missed Q3 9 times. He's scored 9 points in the last 6 Grand Prix. He hasn't been on the podium in a Grand Prix since China. The one light at the end of the tunnel, though, is that back in 2009 he won the GP2 Asia sprint race around this track. So could he perhaps garner that kind of competitive action, and could we see him back on the podium? He's qualified second that race behind Nico Hülkenberg.
He currently sits 14th in the timesheets, but it is only practice. And look, I think I don't think we're going to get a major resurgence. I think it's a very difficult thing for him to do, given the fact that people like us constantly keep talking about him losing his job. So it must be a very difficult thing psychologically to overcome that, let alone what's happening on the racetrack. And they both, of course, feed into each other.
This is the sound of Verstappen, who's out there now on his first fly, now that he's put the soft tyre on, making his way through the left-hander of turn 2. That's how the lap starts. 2 right hand, then a left hand bend, U-shape before you start to put your foot to the floor, through the right hand kink of 3 before you get to turn 4 and turn 5. You start to come back on yourself, a double right hander, then slightly downhill into the left hand braking of turn 6, probably the slowest corner on the track. Then you head slightly uphill towards turn 7. It's not a huge elevation change though, this track fairly flat. Then it's the right hander of 7, 8 and 9 come at you fairly quickly through the right hander of turn 9, getting up to 6th gear, ease off the throttle, down to 4th gear, through turn 10. Then you're coming towards the final sector now. It's foot flat towards turn 12, 13 and 14, the triple right-handers. He's up on Sainz's time at the moment. Leclerc is going quicker though in the Ferraris. We get a proper look at what these cars have got over one lap, and he runs those slightly wide out through turn 15, seeing quite a few cars being caught out there. He keeps it still planted on the track, did kick up a bit of gravel though round the final corner, turn 16, and Max Verstappen then across the line lost time in that final sector, running wide, putting pay to a quick lap time. Stays, goes down to 4th fastest actually, because Leclerc has just put in a mighty time on the softs, a 1:22.2, 8 tenths clear at the top.
Yeah, that was a very, very fast time from Charles Leclerc. He was quick all the way around the lap. I was watching him on the tracker as he went, looked under control, fastest in every sector so far. Everybody bar the Alpine of Pierre Gasly now with the soft tyres on. So this is where we get this real simulation of qualifying, sprint qualifying coming up later on. Carlos Sainz not able so far to match his teammate in the sister Ferrari. He's going quickly but nowhere near to the pace of Charles Leclerc. So Leclerc looking the most comfortable of the two Ferraris at this point on that softer tyre.
Carlos Sainz losing a lot of time in that final sector. I wonder if he caught a bit of traffic, because he's over 7 tenths off his teammate down in second. Still improves in the first 2 sectors though, immediately gets out of it to allow the traffic to come through. But it is busy out there. Everybody is on the track, bar Pierre Gasly and Zhou Guanyu. So everyone putting on that soft tyre and going quickly. Let's see what the 2 McLarens have got as well. We get a sneak peek, a reminder, this is a sprint weekend, the last of the season, with 5 minutes to go of this one and only practice session. We'll get sprint qualifying later on today. You can hear that from 5:25 on 5 Sports Extra.
Both McLarens looking really strong in the early part of the lap on the soft tyre. It'll be Piastri that comes to the line first. He's coming out to close the lap, but his teammate Lando Norris had a very, very fast first sector, slightly less quick in the middle sector, but they're both looking strong now they've bolted on those soft tyres. Let's see what Piastri does as he crosses the line. Second, about 2 tenths behind the Ferrari of Charles Leclerc. So definitely in the mix, but nobody so far can match that blistering time of Charles Leclerc.
This could be teeing up nicely for a proper McLaren versus Ferrari fight till the end of the season. The Constructors' Championship is very much still up for grabs. McLaren could clinch it this weekend. They would have to finish 1-2 in the sprint, 1-2 in the Grand Prix, and take the fastest lap as well, as Lando Norris puts his McLaren up into second. Still can't quite pit that fastest time from Charles Leclerc though.
Yeah, really, really strong. And so Ferrari looking very strong on both types of tyre. That's the big headline, I guess, from the first part of this practice session. We've only got a few minutes left in the session, but Ferrari will come out of this one, I think, happiest of all. McLaren, though, can definitely be considered a contender. That soft tyre really working well. The car coming alive with a little bit more grip coming from that softer red wall tyre. We're looking at Oscar Piastri, who did have to negotiate a number of cars in terms of traffic and finding his way around the lap. So there may still be more time to come from those 2 McLarens, as there definitely will be from the sister Ferrari of Sainz. But I think we are in for a really close call here.
A lot of cars still running out wide though at that turn 15, the left-hander, once you're through the triple right-hander in the final sector, there's a little layer of gravel just on the exit of that curb, and you're punished straight away. Ocon just coming through there now, finding a little bit of gravel too. I wonder if the wind has picked up, particularly in that corner.
And also, as a result of that, a lot of that gravel being dragged onto the circuit, so that's something to watch out for as well. Particularly, you know, there will be a clear line, but if you're not quite on that clear line, there's going to be gravel, and that's going to make things very treacherous. So it's going to have to be kept an eye on. I'm sure in qualifying they'll keep a very close eye on that, and if need be, they'll neutralise the session to clear it up. But that new gravel trap definitely causing issues.
Just saw a bit of an issue with Ocon in the pits, though. That rear right tyre, the tyre wasn't ready, but the man with the gun was. And that's a really easy thing to happen, isn't it, when you're operating in such fine margins? But that's why they practice in these sessions.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, you don't mind it happening now. It's when it happens in the really critical sessions that it matters.
Turnaround of the season, just while we're on pit stops, well, they may well be plumb last and haven't scored any points, but in terms of pit stops, Sauber really managed to turn around their poor form in their pit stops. At one point they were doing about 7-second stops because their equipment just wasn't working.
Yeah,
that is one bit of success they can take away, at least from the season.
And you know, they will have to cling on to whatever positives they can, because it's been a pretty disastrous season on all accounts, on all fronts from them. But yeah, really terrible way to start the season. And I know from experience, when your pit stops are going wrong, they look almost like comical errors when you're watching. It looks like it should be set to some sort of clown music when you watch it back. The reality is it's normally not a human error. It's normally down to some sort of equipment failure or something like that. But it feels awful when you're in the midst of a terrible pit stop. You can almost see the memes happening on social media as you're doing it.
I want to know who at Red Bull doesn't like Valtteri Bottas.
Yeah,
that's what I want to know.
Point.
He dropped to that nice little bombshell for us, didn't he? Because he would be actually probably a very solid number 2 driver.
Well, I think I'm right in saying that he said himself he would be a great number 2 to Max Verstappen. So literally pitching himself in the main team. I can't see it happening. But
is he a contender that we might see, you know, have a season on the sidelines, go back to Mercedes as a reserve, and be a strong front runner to lead a new team like Cadillac?
I think his time's done. Personally, I think his time's done. Not only, I think he's got, you know, he's a great driver, great guy, but I think what we've seen in recent times is there is so much value in young drivers now, more so than we've seen in the past, where they seem better prepared, they seem able to cope with the pressures of Formula 1. They seem to be able to come out of Formula 2, jump in an F1 car and really deliver straight off the bat. And you go back 20 years, you would never really have considered that very often. You know, people like Lewis Hamilton were a real anomaly on that front. Normally you had to cut your teeth in test teams and you know, work your way up for a long time before you got your shot. So I think the whole ethos around that is changing, and therefore I think as a new team you'd probably want to consider a young driver. A, they're cheap, and B, they can do something pretty special.
Who do you think is going to be that Cadillac lineup then?
I think at least one of those drivers will be American. I can feel that happening, and there are a few contenders, you know, from the IndyCar scene. Herta, I can't think of the names. There's a few good drivers around on the fringes of IndyCar that have already been linked to Formula 1. So I think one of them will be that. The other, I don't know, we are 2 years away from it, of course, hitting the track. So by that point, the next generation of F2 drivers will have come through, and there could be another amazing name on the fringes that we're not even really aware of.
Well, that would be a nice rumour to get involved with. But for now, that's practice done. That is the checkered flag out at the end of the one and only practice session. The sun has well and truly set. The floodlights are on full beam around this circuit. Still, some final laps to be set. And talk with the devil, Valtteri Bottas flying in the middle sector. A bit off in that first sector, though, as the fluoro green Sauber really quite prominent when it is set underneath the lights. Where's he going to put that Sauber? Right at the very end of the session. 6th place for Valtteri Bottas.
Decent.
Let's not forget, both Saubers, well, the last time they scored points was at this track last year. Could this be the circuit where Sauber can finally get off the mark? Still 0 points, looking set for a completely pointless season. Their first, it could be, since 2014, and they finished plumb last, 10th 3 times before that, 2014, 16 and 17. So could they do it here? Double points it was for them last time around in Qatar in 2023. Oscar Piastri just running out a little wide as well in those final laps. But at the end of the session, Charles Leclerc managed to eke out even more time. 4 tenths clear, I should say, at the front of the field, Leclerc. Then it's Norris, Piastri, Sainz, the top 4. The two teams fighting for the constructors' battle, setting things up nicely from the off. Yuki Tsunoda in the RB finishing 5th ahead of Bottas. Stroll, Russell, Albon, Hamilton is 10th ahead of Max Verstappen down in 11th. Didn't quite see what he had on that soft tyre towards the end. Then it was Alonso, Hulkenberg, Lawson, Gasly the top 15, Magnussen, Joe, Perez 18th ahead of Franco Colapinto, and Esteban Ocon, the 20 drivers to take part in that session. Rosanna.
I'm just watching mechanics walk up the pit lane. The Sauber mechanics have been asked, obviously, to go to the weighbridge. One of their drivers would have been called in, so they're slowly making their way up with the leaf blowers, ready to collect the car. The cars are waiting on the start-finish straight as well to practice their starts. I can just see over the wall. I can see the Alpine pulling away. So busy trying to get some practice in when it comes to starts, because, of course, we've got 2 races this weekend. We've got the sprint and, of course, we've got the Grand Prix itself. And can I throw a name into the ring for the Cadillac seat, guys?
I will allow it, yeah.
Ugo Ukachukwu, how about that? Won Macau, didn't he? And he's an American driver. That could be a perfect link-up.
He's backed by McLaren, isn't he, at the moment? So that could be...
Contract.
Well, Gabriel Bortoletto, it's a very good shout. I still think that you'd want, if you're going for one rookie, an American, possibly in one seat, for a new team, brand new, you want somebody who knows Formula One, has that experience, and Bottas is a prime candidate. You know, somebody like, well, you don't know who will be on the market as well at that point.
Exactly,
you
right.
could even say somebody like Kevin Magnussen. It's an outside shot, but you want somebody like when Haas came in to spearhead that team.
And who's to say the rookie can't be the American? You know, there might be a young American out there that we don't know about that could, by the time 26 comes around, be in the frame. So I think we're some way away from making that decision, or certainly hearing about that decision, and I think anything can happen really over the course of 12 months in Formula One.
Well, then, we are right at the end of free practice 1 with the standing starts, practice starts being done at the end. It looks, Mark, like it's being set up nicely for a battle between McLaren and Ferrari, both fighting ferociously for that constructors' title. Yeah, really strong first session from both of those teams. A lot of unknowns still. There was so much traffic, so many laps, compromised by traffic. The wind being a major factor. A lot of people being caught out by that and running wide. So there's a lot of time left on the table that we haven't yet seen from some drivers. I think we see more from each of those top 4 still. Definitely think we're going to see Verstappen somewhere in the mix, and I think although the Mercedes have clearly they weren't completely happy, certainly in the hands of Lewis Hamilton seems particularly unhappy. In fact, George Russell often, I think, can show a little bit more when it matters. Well, we go into qualifying for the sprint next up. You can join us for that on 5 Sports Extra from 5:25. My thanks to Andrew Benson, to Mark Priestley, to Rosanna Tennant. That is the order of play for the rest of the day. This has been an IMG production for BBC Radio 5 Live.